I never imagined that an ordinary night at the fall fair could change my life. Since I was a child, the fair has always been a magical event, with lights dancing in the air, the smell of caramelized apples, and the distant sound of the slowly spinning Ferris wheel. But that night, between laughter and cotton candy, something happened. Something that still makes me wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat. Before we continue, turn off the lights, grab your headphones, and click subscribe to support the channel. Now let me tell you how it all started. The fair looked different that year. The tents were older, as if they had come out of a distant past. The people, though animated, seemed to be shadows of themselves. And it was there, between the gaming stall and the carousel, that I realized something that would make me question what was real. Someone had disappeared. The fair was at its peak. Laughter echoed from all sides, and the lights pulsed as if dancing to distant music. But among all that vibrant energy, something seemed shifted. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but the feeling enveloped me like an icy breeze in the middle of summer. As I walked through the play area, something caught my attention. A boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, was crying near the target shooting tent. His mother, or who I assumed was his mother, looked frantically around. The boy said he had seen a man in a red hat leading his brother behind the tents. The people around tried to calm them down, saying that it must be just a mess. But I saw the expression on the woman's face. It wasn't just concern. It was pure fear. I thought about getting closer, but something held me back. Maybe it was the insistent noise of the Ferris wheel or the scream of someone winning a prize in the fishing tent. Even so, that scene stayed with me. Later, as I was walking away from the turmoil, I noticed something that made my heart race. A poster on the wall next to the cotton candy stand. It was not new. The photo was of a child with the words, "Disappeared Autumn Fair 10 years ago." The boy in the photo looked a lot like the boy I had just seen crying. The night was just beginning. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Comment below as we continue this scary story. The lively sounds of the fair seemed muffled now, as if I were hearing everything through a veil. That poster kept coming out of my head. I decided to go back to the place where I had seen the boy and his mother, but they had disappeared. I decided to walk through the less crowded areas of the fair, the ones where the lights didn't shine so brightly. The feeling of being watched grew with each step. Passing the mirror tent, my eyes were drawn to something peculiar, a reflection that shouldn't be there. I approached slowly, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. On the dusty glass, I saw something that looked like a shadow. It wasn't mine. She was tall and standing behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. The reflection disappeared, crossing a corridor between closed tents. The silence there was almost deafening. A faint smell of rust in the air made me wrinkle my nose. I was wondering what I was doing there when I heard a low, shuffling sound. "Help me?" The voice was faint, almost like a whisper, coming from behind one of the tents. My heart raced, but something inside me pushed me forward. As I approached, I saw marks on the ground, small but disorderly footprints, as if someone had been pulled. I approached an opening in the side of one of the tents and saw a makeshift corridor, illuminated by a flickering light. It didn't seem to be part of the fair. It was as if I had crossed an invisible line into a place where no one should be. I kept walking, feeling that each step took me further away from safety. The corridor seemed to extend forever. The flickering light cast shadows that moved as if they had a mind of their own. My heart beat fast, but my feet didn't stop. Something pulled me forward, as if I was being called. Suddenly, the sound of laughter broke the silence. But these laughs were not at all joyful. They were low, almost stuffy, as if they came from many places at once. I looked around and realized that the walls of the hallway were covered in pictures. Photos of children, families, smiling couples, all posing in front of the entrance to the fair. Some images looked fresh, but others were clearly old, with yellowed edges and faded faces. There was something strange about them. Many of the faces were scrawled, as if someone had tried to erase them in anger. And then I realized, each of the photos had something in common. A figure in the background, always out of focus. A man in a red hat. I swallowed hard and walked away, but as I did so, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I heard the sound of laughter again, now louder, as if it was coming from inside my head. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing fear. The corridor finally opened to a larger space, a kind of warehouse, with antique objects scattered everywhere. Disassembled carousels, wooden horses, cracked mirrors. It was as if the fair had left behind an older version of itself, forgotten and hidden. In the center of the warehouse, there was a book. His pages were worn out, and he seemed to emanate a dark energy. When I opened it, I realized it was a record, names, dates, and disappearances. Each name had a date next to it, and the descriptions detailed what appeared to be a signed contract. My name wasn't there, yet. I closed the book quickly, but then I heard footsteps behind me. Slowly, I turned to face what seemed to be the beginning of my worst nightmare. The footsteps echoed in the warehouse like hammers, each closer than the last. My body froze, but my mind screamed for me to run. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall, slender, with a red hat that seemed to absorb the little light of the place. There was no face, just a darkness where the eyes should be. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice resounding like a whisper and a scream at the same time. I tried to back up, but tripped over one of the fallen wooden horses. The man tilted his head in a strange, almost curious way. In his hands, he held something that looked like an old entrance ticket to the fair, with my name engraved on it. "You can't leave without paying," he said. I knew I needed to act fast. My eyes darted through the warehouse to the book I had found. It was still there, open, glowing faintly. I remembered the pages full of names and dates. Somehow, that book was the key. Gathering all the courage I could, I ran towards the book. The man in the hat reached out, and it was as if the very air around me had become heavy, pulling me back. But I didn't stop. I grabbed the book and began to tear its pages, one by one. Each torn page seemed to weaken him. He stumbled, and the hat fell to the ground, revealing nothing. Where a face should be, there was only emptiness. A darkness so deep that it seemed to pull everything around inside. The warehouse began to shake. Lights flashed, and the laughter I had heard before returned, but now it was screams. The walls began to crumble, and I knew I was short on time. With the last page in my hands, I shouted, "What are you? Why do you do this?" His voice echoed as the space around us seemed to implode. "I am the fair, and everyone who enters belongs to me." I tore up the final page, and the warehouse disappeared. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the entrance of the fair. The lights flickered, the laughter echoed, and the sweet smell of cotton candy filled the air. It was as if nothing had happened, but something was different. I looked at my hands and realized that I was still holding a piece of the book, a torn page. It was blank except for a single sentence written in somber letters. "The fair always returns." I got up with difficulty and looked around. People passed me by as if I were invisible. I looked for the tent where I had seen the boy crying, but it was no longer there. That strange corridor and the warehouse no longer existed, or had never existed. On the way back to the parking lot, I felt that something was wrong. The shadows seemed longer, deeper. And when I got to my car, I saw a handprint on the rear window, on the inside. Since that night, I have never been the same. There are times when I hear distant laughter, even at home, in the silence of the early morning. Sometimes I see reflections in mirrors that don't belong to me. And every night, I have the same nightmare. The man in the red hat, standing at the entrance to the fair, holding that note with my name on it. I still keep the torn page, hidden in a locked drawer. But I know she won't protect me, because autumn has arrived again, and with it, the lights of the fair are already beginning to appear in the distance. I was never one to believe in old stories. To me, they were just that, stories, nothing more. But everything changed when I moved to that house in the countryside. It was a secluded place, surrounded by tall trees and dirt trails forgotten by time. There, right in the middle of the lot, there was a well, old, covered in moss, with worn stones, and a wooden lid that seemed about to collapse. Locals spoke of him with some discomfort, as if his name were taboo. "Stay away from the well," they told me. And for a while I stayed, until one night, as the wind howled through the trees, I heard something. A faint, jagged sound coming from the bottom of the well, as if someone or something was trying to get out. The land where the house stood seemed to have been frozen in time. Trees with twisted branches surrounded the site, and the access path was almost invisible, swallowed by vegetation. When I moved there, I realized that the place had a peculiar aura to it, something you feel but can't explain. It was while cleaning the yard that I found the well. It was covered in dry leaves and almost hidden among the bushes. The wooden lid creaked at any touch, and the smell of moisture mixed with something else, something metallic, filled the air. Curious, I carefully removed the lid. The sound of rusty hinges echoed like a muffled scream, disappearing into the deep end. I looked inside, but I saw only darkness. Not even the light from the cell phone could reach the bottom. It was just an old well, I thought. A danger to children or animals, perhaps. Still, something in that deep emptiness bothered me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, even in the sweltering heat of the afternoon. Days later, while talking to a neighbor, I mentioned the well casually. He stopped talking, his eyes wide as if I had said something forbidden. He asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, confused. It was then that he told me, in whispers, about the disappearances and noises that the former owners of the property reported. And, of course, about the man from the well. I laughed, thinking it was just another story to scare newcomers. But that same night, I heard it again. The sound faint, distant, as if something was moving inside. After that day, I started to hear more stories about the well. The older residents spoke of him with reverence, almost as if they were afraid of attracting unwanted attention. It was one of those legends that everyone knows, but no one likes to mention. They said that the man in the well was not just any person. He had lived there many years ago, before the city was what it is today. He was described as a reclusive man with strange habits, who talked to things that no one could see. The most frightening rumor was that he had disappeared without a trace. According to the story, on a cold November night, residents heard screams coming from the well. When they went to investigate, they only found nail marks on the edges, as if someone had been dragged inside. Others said that he did not disappear, but chose to enter the well voluntarily, carried by a force that no one understood. Since then, strange things have started to happen. People heard voices coming from the background, especially at night. Some swore they had seen a thin, bright-eyed figure prowling the area. However, what really made me uneasy was the warning of a lady in the city. The well only calls for those who can hear. You heard, didn't you? I wanted to deny it, but her words hit me hard. The following nights were even more tense. The sounds did not stop. Now, they were accompanied by something else. Light knocks, as if someone was trying to get out. I knew I needed to find out what was at the bottom of that well. But at the same time, something was telling me to stay away. The silence that night was different, denser. Even the wind seemed to avoid it. I was alone in the house, the only light coming from a dim lamp in the living room. But even there, with the doors locked, the sound seemed to call me. A low echo, almost like a whisper, came from outside. It was the well. I knew it. I took a flashlight and, against common sense, went out to investigate. The damp grass made my steps seem taller than they should have. As I got closer, the sound became clearer. It was not a moan as I had imagined, but something that resembled a voice. Indistinct words, as if they were spoken in an ancient language. When I got to the well, I hesitated. The wooden lid was open, swaying slightly as if someone had moved it moments before. The light from the flashlight flickered along with my hand as I illuminated the interior. Nothing, just an emptiness that seemed to consume the light. Then I heard, "Help me?" His voice was weak, masculine, almost muted. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind playing with my imagination, but something in the tone, in the way it echoed, told me the opposite. I leaned in, trying to see better, and suddenly a dry sound, a crack, echoed from inside. I retreated instinctively, almost stumbling. The flashlight fell from my hand, its light rolling to the edge of the well, illuminating something for a brief moment. One hand, thin, pale, fingers too long to be human. Before I could process what I was seeing, the flashlight went out. Everything around me plunged into darkness, except for the sound of beating against the stone of the well, faster and faster, louder and louder. I ran back to the house, my heart almost exploding in my chest. I closed the door and walked away, but the knocking continued for long minutes, until they disappeared completely. I should have stopped there, I should have left, but now I knew that something or someone was at rock bottom waiting. The well was waiting. That was the feeling that overwhelmed me as I stared at him from the living room window that night. It was as if the beats that had ceased hours earlier had left something in the air, an invisible presence, but impossible to ignore. I tried to continue with the routine. I made a coffee, turned on the television, anything to occupy my mind. But every time my eyes wandered, they ended up going back to the darkness outside. The well seemed to be calling me. I gave in to curiosity, or perhaps madness, and went back to him. This time, he carried a rope, a hook, and a more powerful flashlight. If there was something down there, I needed to know. When I removed the lid again, the sound sounded different, deeper, as if the well was infinite. I tied the rope tightly to one of the nearby beams and threw the hook inside. The rope swayed, tense, until it finally stopped. "If you're here," I whispered, without finishing the sentence, as if waiting for an answer. The light from the lantern pierced the darkness in layers. Gradually, something began to emerge. First, I saw the glow of something metallic, a rusty bucket stuck to the wall. Then a drawing, engraved in stone, symbols that made no sense, but seemed to vibrate with an energy of their own. I continued down the beam of light. That's when I saw it. Something flashed, like eyes reflecting the light of the flashlight, two fixed, inhuman points that stared at me from the bottom of the well. My heart raced. I wanted to move away, but something held me there, paralyzed. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. "You're back?" I took a step back, almost stumbling, but something emerged from the shadows. Not a complete figure, but a hand, that same long, pale hand that I had seen before. She touched the edge of the well and stood there, motionless, as if waiting. Suddenly, I felt the rope in my hand move, a quick and strong pull, as if something wanted to drag me inside. I let go of the rope immediately, falling backwards, as it disappeared into the well as if pulled by an invisible force. I closed the lid with all my might, pushing the old wood into place. Only after securing her with stones did I be able to breathe again. But I knew that this was not the end. The well was waiting, and now he was sure it was no accident. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the well. I felt the rope being pulled. I heard the voice. The "you're back" echoed in my mind like a sentence. In the morning, I decided that it had to end. I didn't know if I was dealing with something supernatural, my own madness, or some kind of nightmare that had taken shape. But he knew he needed to go back to the well and face whatever was there. I took with me a gallon of kerosene and a lighter. It wasn't the wisest decision, but my logic was simple. If the well was a door to something, I would destroy it. The sun was already setting when I arrived at the place. The well looked different, as if waiting for me. The wooden lid, which I had secured with stones, was open again. This time, however, there were no sounds, no voices, just silence. With trembling hands, I poured the kerosene around the well and finally on its edge. I lit the lighter and stood there, watching the flame dance between my fingers. All it took was one movement, and it would all be over. But before I could throw the fire, the voice came back. "You promised." It was stronger, more real, and it didn't come from the well. It came from behind me. I turned the body, but there was no one there. Just the suffocating feeling that I was being watched. When I looked again at the well, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure rose slowly, coming out of the darkness. The pale skin contrasted with the darkness of the well, and the eyes, empty, lifeless, seemed to pierce me. It wasn't human, not anymore. He was tall, thin, with fingers that stretched out like claws and a hungry expression on his cadaverous face. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure stopped at the edge, tilting its head as if it were analyzing me. The voice was whispered, but it carried the weight of thunder. Before I could react, the creature reached out toward me. I felt a tug, as if something was dragging me into an invisible abyss. Everything around me began to darken, and the world seemed to disappear. When I woke up, it was already daylight. He was lying on the grass by the side of the well, with the lid firmly closed. The kerosene can was empty, but there were no signs of fire. I should have left at that moment, but instead I stood there, staring at the well, because now I knew. The well is not just a place. It's a door, and somehow, I was the key he had been waiting for. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? I'm not talking about a passing sensation or the fruit of imagination, but that real weight on your back, as if invisible eyes were fixed on you. It was late, and the last bus of the night seemed empty, except for me. At least that's what I thought, until you noticed the reflection on the window glass. There was no one there when I walked in, but now at the end of the hallway, a man was sitting, motionless, staring at me. And it was there at that moment that I realized this would not be just any trip. It was a night like any other. The cold wind hissed through the deserted streets, and the lamps on the streetlights flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows across the asphalt. I got on the bus almost empty, as I always did after the night shift. The driver, a man with a tired expression and sunken eyes, just nodded his head as I passed the turnstile. I chose a seat near the middle, far enough away from the driver that it didn't feel awkward, but not so deep down. That's where the silence felt heaviest. The light above flickered slightly, and the sound of the engine echoed rhythmically, almost like a lullaby. I looked around. Only 2 passengers were there. An elderly lady, with a bag tied to her chest, sat near the back door. She looked nervous, her eyes popping from one direction to another. And a young man, with a hood pulled over his face, was in one of the front seats, practically motionless. It was a path I knew well. The curves, the empty stops, even the worn ads stuck in the windows. But that night, something seemed different. The bus seemed slower, as if it was hesitating at every corner. The lampposts outside illuminated the interior in quick flashes, creating strange shapes on the walls and floor. It was then that I realized there was no sign of any other vehicle on the road. No car, no motorcycle, no pedestrian. Only us. The bus stopped at a traffic light, and a high-pitched noise echoed down the hallway. A shiver went up my spine. I turned my head instinctively, and in the reflection of the window, I saw something that froze me. Someone had sat at the back of the bus. I knew that figure was not there when I entered. The empty seat at the back of the bus was always my point of reference. But now, a presence occupied that space, motionless, silent. I tried to glance through the reflection of the window, but the flashing light made it impossible to make out any detail. Something in me hesitated to turn my head directly. Maybe it was instinct, the one that screams at you to avoid danger, even when you don't fully understand it. Finally, I mustered up my courage and slowly turned my face. What I saw should not be strange, but something was wrong. He was an apparently ordinary man. He wore an old, faded suit, as if it had come out of a photograph from the 50s. His shoes were shining, though the rest of his appearance was expense. But what really bothered me was how he was sitting, stiff, with his hands resting on his knees, as if he had been placed there, instead of having sat down of his own free will. His eyes were lowered, fixed on the hallway, but there was something about the contours of his face that made me uneasy, an unnatural rigidity. The bus shook as it passed a hole, and it didn't move an inch, as if it were a statue. I looked around, hoping someone else would notice. The lady with her tight purse was now even more restless, almost trembling. The boy in the hood kept his gaze fixed on the ground, ignoring everything around him. It seemed that I was the only one who really realized the strangeness of that figure. My heart raced when he finally raised his head. Slowly, his eyes met mine. There was something wrong with that look. It wasn't human, or if it was empty, as if all life had been sucked out of it. It was then that the driver, who until that moment had been driving in silence, muttered something to himself. I couldn't hear it properly, but it sounded something like, "Not again." A chill ran through my body. What new? The silence inside the bus seemed to grow, suffocating. Even the sound of the engine, which had once filled the void, now sounded distant, as if it were being drowned out by an invisible force. The man in the back didn't look away from me, and as much as I wanted to, it was impossible to ignore his presence. The driver began to act strangely. His hands, once firmly on the steering wheel, now trembled visibly. He adjusted his rearview mirror every few seconds, casting uneasy glances toward the back of the bus, and for some reason, avoided looking directly at the mysterious passenger. The bus made an unexpected turn, leaving the usual route. My heart tightened. I knew that path by heart, and I knew we were far from the right path. "Hey, that's not the route," he said, trying to sound confident. But my voice came out weaker than I expected. The driver did not respond. He just sped up, his eyes fixed on the road. It was the elderly lady who finally broke the silence. He does that sometimes," she murmured, almost to herself. When I looked at her, I noticed that her hands were shaking so much that the bag almost slipped from her lap. I made a point of getting up, but something stuck me to the bench. Not physically, but an overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't move. As if in doing so, I crossed an invisible boundary. Suddenly, the interior lights of the bus began to flash violently. With each flash, the environment seemed different. The colors faded. The shapes became blurred, as if we were crossing a place that did not belong to this world. Then came the sound, a low noise, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper echoing through the corridors. But soon it got louder, more distinctive. It wasn't a voice, but a mixture of sounds, distorted laughter, muffled crying, and something that sounded like a choke scream. That's when I realized. The other passengers were just as scared as I was, but the man in the background, he remained motionless, unshaken, as if none of it affected him. And then, in a moment of courage or sheer madness, I decided to face him again. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on the driver, who was now sweating profusely and muttering something inaudible, as the bus accelerated further and further. "You shouldn't be here," the lady said suddenly, her voice low, but full of dread. I didn't know if she was talking to me or to herself. Before I could answer, the bus gave a violent jolt and the lights went out completely. The darkness inside the bus was absolute. For a moment, the only thing that existed was the irregular sound of the engine and my own panting. I wanted to believe that it was just a power failure, something trivial, but the feeling that there was something more growing up in the environment was inescapable. Suddenly, the lights flashed back, but what they revealed didn't make sense. The interior of the bus had changed. The floor was covered in strange marks, as if someone had scratched the metal with sharp claws. The windows, which once reflected the city, now showed only an opaque darkness, as if the bus was moving through an absolute void. And then I saw him, the man in the background. He was no longer seated. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, a few feet from me. I didn't see when he got up, and that was the most disturbing thing. It was as if he had simply appeared there. Her eyes, empty, dull, were fixed on me, and a slight curve in her lips formed something that looked like a smile, but was anything human. Who are you?" My voice came out weak, barely audible. He tilted his head, as if trying to understand my question. It was then that he spoke, but his voice did not come from his mouth. It echoed through the bus, multiple voices overlapping, as if a crowd spoke in unison. "You're in the wrong place." Those words made the ground beneath me seem to collapse. I looked around, expecting some reaction from the other passengers. But the old lady was completely still, like a statue. The boy in the hood didn't move either, his head now hanging at an odd angle, as if his neck had given way. The driver, who had previously seemed nervous, was now in complete panic. He mumbled something as he squeezed the steering wheel so hard that his fingers turned white. "I didn't want to. I had no choice," he repeated, like a desperate mantra. It was then that I noticed something frightening. The number of passengers had changed. There were more people on the bus now, shadowy, indistinct figures, occupying the seats that were once empty. They did not move, but their eyes shone in the darkness, fixed on me. The man in the hallway began to approach. Every step he took seemed to echo in my chest, as if gravity increased around him. When he finally stopped in front of me, everything around me seemed to freeze. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, and this time I felt as if the words were being whispered directly into my mind. And then he held out his hand. I didn't have time to react. An icy touch ran down my arm, and suddenly I was seized by a whirlwind of images, places I had never seen, but which seemed somehow familiar, distorted faces, screams, and the sound of a bus echoing in an endless void. When I opened my eyes again, the man was gone, but something had changed. I was no longer on the bus. The sound of the engine was gone. The world around me was now a thick fog, an emptiness, with no beginning or end. There were no more seats, passengers, or even the bus. I was alone, standing on something that looked like the ground, but was as opaque and indistinct as the air around me. The feeling of being watched returned, but this time it was overwhelming. I looked around, but there was nothing, just silence, dense and oppressive. That's when I heard that voice, or voices, echoing in my mind again. "You shouldn't have gone in." Suddenly, images began to emerge in the fog. I saw the bus, now abandoned, parked on a detour I had never seen before. Their windows were dirty, covered in a thick layer of dust and handprints. Inside it, the same shadowy figures that had surrounded me before stood motionless, like eternal passengers on an endless journey. I was among them. My reflection appeared in one of the windows of the bus. My face was pale, empty, like the others. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was then that I realized the truth. I had never gotten off the bus. The last thing I saw was the vehicle disappearing into the darkness, as if it was being swallowed by a bottomless abyss. And within me, to this day, I wonder what happened that night. Some people say there's something wrong with that night bus, something no one can explain. Others think it's just an urban legend. But I know the truth because I'm still here, trapped in this place, telling my story to those who, perhaps, can escape before it's too late. If you like this story and want to hear more scary stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Leave the like to support the content. Share with your friends who love spine-tingling stories.